We spent a good amount of time in the last lecture with me giving you encouragement to redouble your efforts. We have talked about in this class, day after day, week after week, the core principles of developing charcoal drawing and those challenging roadblocks that exist in working from life, especially talking about the severe time limit that we have to learn to deal with to work from life. We've talked about that week after week after week. We've talked about gaining the understanding of using your value to represent the complexity of your subject with the very difficult limitations of just a stick of charcoal and a piece of paper. We've talked every single week about meeting that challenge. You recall that as we talked, there was the additional one about how our eyes tend to fool us, about how we look at the individual parts of our subject and get lost in the complexity of it. So let's take a look at someone who definitely has developed that skill set, who's put in the time to really do something special, to make it special, to make it their own. And this is from the artist Xiaoming Wu, who has earned a lot of approbation and respect and awe from artists, art collectors, and the general public. You see, as we look at through some of his figurative works here in grayscale, since we're primarily focusing on value and tone in this class, I'm presenting it to you this way. As we've discussed the process of editing, emphasizing certain things about your subject and editing out other things and making those decisions based on the principles discussed, you see that he has really taken the distance in creating something special with a great deal of selectivity, with a great deal of hard and soft and lost and found edges, with a great deal of artistry. And you can see more of his work at xiaomingwu.com. And underneath every one of those paintings is something that I think you need to focus a little bit harder on. And that is rock solid, core, three-dimensional sculptural drawing skills. We said early on that you need to make your drawings look like, or at least have the ability to make your drawings look such that you could hand them to a sculptor, and the sculptor could take with nothing more than your drawings and accurately sculpt the subject. This is another drawing by Xiaoming Wu, much more along the lines of the kinds of things that we're doing in this class. And you can see that all of that artistry that we've just looked at is highly informed by his ability to do what we are learning to do in this class. And so I'm noticing with my live class that they really need to focus more on work like this. Clear, solid, simple portrait studies from life. Because they're doing things like focusing on part of the head but maybe not committing to what the other part of the head is. They're not committing, well, what is the back side of the head? Where does that end and the background begin? They're doing things part and parcel and piecemeal rather than a rock solid core head study. Even as we're coming closer to the end of class, I'm referring them to this drawing and asking them to definitely push in this direction so that as we go through the next couple of weeks, hitting our stride and doing even more than that, picking up our gait to sprint the distance to the end here. All right. Speaking of someone who sprinted the entirety of their career, let's take a look now at the work of Diego Velázquez. This is a quite respectable painting that Velázquez did. It has impressive lighting, it has impressive rendering, and yet there's something a little bit awkward about it. As we look at the detail in it, as we look at the folds of skin here, the wrinkle, folds of skin here, and especially some of the folds of skin here, the way they curve kind of in and out and back and forth and wrap around in various directions, sometimes with the form, sometimes against the form. there's something a little bit awkward about it. It almost gives this character a feeling of being made out of clay rather than living, soft flesh that wraps around those forms. Velázquez is, in fact, a little bit guilty here of exactly the thing that we've been discussing in class frequently to look out for, which is noticing individual contrasts and rendering them in isolation rather than rendering them in a way that accurately describes the larger forms and wrap around the whole. Now, at this point, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, whoa, 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 wait a minute, stop the train, Nathan. We like you and everything, but you're criticizing Velázquez? Well, here's my justification for doing that. This portrait, in fact, was painted when Velázquez was a very young man in his very early 20s. He was still learning. I believe that if Velázquez were here, he would agree with me that it was an early painting which suffered from some of the same challenges that we suffer from. Guys, that is very good news for us, because this is the guy who could pull off these kinds of portraits later in his career. This is a portrait that was done about a decade after this one was done in his early 30s, long before photography. And look at that image. Look at the subtlety, the simplicity, the clarity of the rendering. Oh my gosh, to pull this off at the time when he was painting, the subtlety of it, extraordinary. Those problems that he may have had early on in his career, they are gone. This is truly an old master who understands light and form and value and rendering. With the bright but indirect lighting we've been looking at the previous week, and rendering the nuances and sculptural turning of form with that kind of light. Here it is, dead on, gorgeous, crystal clear. Let's zoom in on that face and just take a look at the elegant simplicity of how those forms, just catch the highlights. Anywhere the form is facing the light, catches the highlights and just simply turns darker as it curves away from the form. So we'll zoom in real close on that eye, and that eye reads so clearly and so beautifully as we look at the full thing, because he understands the principle that I have hoped we can and have elucidated in this class, which is when forms are challenging, simply turn them into geometry. Because I've just painted over to show that if you treat that eye as a simple sphere turning from light into shadow, all of a sudden the difficulty and complexity of an eye becomes manageable. Here we have form in the light, and then it gradually turns away into shadow. And then it turns up into light, and then it gradually turns away into shadow, and then the form turns back up into light, and then goes through the halftone and back into shadow. If you think simply and sculpturally like this, it opens up the whole world to you. It's what the old masters understood, and it's what will get us the distance in the elegant simplicity of our rendering.